Sfaradim Shomrei Torah, right? The Sfaradi Torah Guardians. Now, there's a reason why it was named the way it was named. And here we go. First of all, it was founded in 1984 by disillusioned members of Agudat Yisrael, which was the Ashkenazi-dominated religious party. So the Sfaradim in that part, of the Sfaradi religious people, like Aryeh Deri, for example, was the main part of that, of that group, broke away and formed Shas. Now, the interesting thing about Shas was that it wasn't only the religious Faradim that joined the party. Now, remember, this is the 80s, the early 80s, 1984. This is after Menachem Begin has made his speech about Chachachim, they would never use that name, and brought in large numbers of Sfaradi voters into the Likud. But the religious people in that group said, we need a religious Sfaradi party. And that's how Shas was formed. In 1984, they won 4 seats, first time round. In 1986, increased to 6, and so they went on building up. But, here's the big but. What they demanded every time as a condition to joining the government, which they did, was we only want to be in charge of the Ministry of Interior. Why the Ministry of Interior? Because the Ministry of Interior controlled the budget to the yeshivot, to the religious projects, and they wanted the budgets for that. By 1996, they had won 10 seats, and they'd become the 3rd largest party in the Knesset. And they would do anything, just give us the money. Now show me the money kind of thing. And they did it big time. And there's a huge sums of money, by the way. Remember, this is taxpayers' money. The yeshiva brochers, the yeshiva bochers, don't pay tax because they don't work. So for Israelis, this already became the secular Israelis, the working taxpayers Israelis. This became an issue as early on as 1996. But they were powerful, right? It went further than that because during the 2000s, the years of the 2000s, they made coalitions with both the Likud and the Labour. As long as they had control of the Ministry of Interior, they would make deals with Faustus, whoever was going to give them the money. Now, remember as well that Labour, in its day, this is when Labour was still a proper party, or had become a proper party again, believed in the status quo. Now, the status quo meant going back to 1948, when David Ben-Gurion made the biggest mistake politically ever that has repercussions right the way through till today. What was it? That he wanted the religious parties to be in control of marriage and everything to do with internal politics within the country. That was the status quo. And nothing would change. And no government has ever managed to change the status quo as a result. And if people ask me, well, I'm David Ben-Gurion, my big hero, right? That for me has always been an indictment of where he was going to. So they were able to channel huge sums of money into religious projects, primarily within the settlements in the West Bank and the yeshivot. But of course, what happens when you have that kind of thing? In 1999, Aryeh Deri, who was the Minister of Interior at the time, was convicted of bribery, fraud, and breach of trust. The big thing is called breach of trust. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison, which he had to serve, and he was carried to the jail on the shoulders of his supporters and his yeshiva boys. Who's the Minister of the Interior past in the last government? Aryeh Deri. Aryeh Deri is one of the ministers who's facing allegations of fraud. Shas. Okay? As you might gather, I don't bring my opinions to this presentation, but you might have gathered where I sit as far as Shas is concerned. The next one is the United Torah Judaism, the Yadu Torah. Now you'll notice here that the majority of these religious factions, because that's what they are founded in the later years. 84 was the last one, 92. Now this is an alliance. It became a party, but initially was set up as an alliance between Agudat Yisrael and Degel Torah. Now Degel Torah, people who go back a long time will remember the name Rav Druckmann. Druckmann was around in the 60s. He's still around. And you'll see why in a minute. Now, these guys decided that when Shas pulled a lot of their voters away, they needed to increase the Ashkenazi presence in the Knesset to balance the Sephardi religious parties in the Knesset. On, well, not racial lines, but on root lines, if you like. Ashkenazi, Haredi. But in 2004, they split over rabbinical differences, and you'll see why in a minute. But these factions, these parties, are run by the rabbis in their councils. And you'll see who the rabbis are in 1 minute. In the 2019, 2020, remember we had 4 elections in 2 years. They had the highest number of seats, and they've still got that. 8. They've got 6 now, I think, right? Between 6 and 8, but they went between them. But the most important thing is they are not only non-Zionists, they call themselves non-Zionists, a lot of them are anti-Zionist, which is very, very difficult to explain because they sometimes sit in government, and they have. Litzman, and you'll see I put Litzman and Gafni because it always is personality focused, the leader of the party. Litzman was the Minister of Health until the COVID crisis arrived. Litzman is also up on a major charge. What's his charge? For people who've got contacts with Australia, might know of this case. There was a Rebbitzin, there is a Rebbitzin, she was a Rebbitzin, is whatever, who was accused of sexually abusing girls in her yeshiva. A woman. Serious allegations in Sydney. She fled to Israel and joined, or was part of, Litzman's rabbinical circle. And he protected her from extradition. The Australians demanded extradition, and Litzman, who was the minister, he was also sort of going between Minister of Justice and Minister of Health. He was always in the ministry. He was a black hat guy, of course. Rabbi, Rav Litzman, American by birth. You know, he speaks with an American accent, but obviously he's Israeli. And he protected her for years and years and years until a year ago, about 9 months ago. There was a Supreme Court order for her to be extradited, and she now is standing trial in Australia. But this, when I say this faction is always personality focused. The initial leader, for want of a better word, the founders, there was a guy by the name of Rabbi Eliezer Shach. Interesting guy. I don't want to go into too much detail. But one of the big things that he pushed more than anything else, that women were not allowed to stand for election as members of the Yadu Torah, the UTJ, right? So that in itself was problematic, but that's what Jewish law is about. Agudat Yisrael faction policy is made by the Council of Torah sages. That's why I said we have to wait and see how it's focused. Now, senior and elderly rabbis means guys in their late 90s. One of them, you'll see in a minute, who belongs to the Degla Torah faction, also run by sages, is a guy by the name of Rabbi Kanievsky. Now, what Kanievsky says, Yadu Torah does. Now, you see the most bizarre interaction between Kanievsky's grandson, who must be in his 50s. I lie, he's in his 40s, right? Whispering in his ear, trying to explain to him what the bill is that they should be voting for or against. What does Rabbi Kanievsky decide? That's the decision. And he's being whispered to by his grandson. Nobody knows what he's saying. And Rabbi Kanievsky says, against. And of course they vote against. Or Rabbi Kanievsky says, in favor, in favor. The policy decisions by, where am I? Why is this not moving? I don't know. Hang on. Not moving for some reason. There we go. Okay. We go on to what is their ideology based on? In other words, what's their manifesto about? So the first thing is Ashkenazi Haredi Judaism. I'm not going to go into it. You go and look it up yourself. But it's very clear that they are religiously very conservative. They are non-Zionist and they are right-wing, whatever that might mean. I don't know, you can be a non-Zionist and be right, but it doesn't matter. But that's what they run on. It's serious. I could have written anything up there. What Rabbi Kanievsky says, the religious communities will do. And that's Yadu Torah. The last one we come to, which is very important, is the ones that I will bring my opinion to the table. And you'll see why in a minute. These are the religious Zionists. Hatzionut Hadatit. Okay? Their leader is a guy by the name of Bezalel Smotrich. And we're going to talk about him in the next slide. But let's just look at the history of it a bit. It was formerly known as Tekuma, which means revival. Now, this party has changed its DNA and its makeup as it goes along because it joins with other factions in order to get power. This is about power and nothing else. They are far-right religiously Zionist, which means right-wing, let me get there, right-wing populism and ultra-nationalism put together. This is the guy who you'll see in a minute made a statement 2 days ago in the Knesset that has gone viral and causing huge damage. And you'll see why in a minute. But I first just want to talk about how it was established. Now, Tekuma, the revival, the initial party was established in 1998 by a guy called, well, two guys, but the main guy was a guy called Hanan Porat, who I knew personally very well because he was debating with me in 1977 election. We used to run into each other at the kibbutzim that we were trying to get to vote for the Shas Party. If you remember, I spoke about that once before. In Yigal Yadin's party, he was obviously talking to kibbutzim. He was a kibbutz member of one of the kibbutzim in the West Bank. Doesn't matter which one. A very nice guy. He unfortunately died of cancer 4 or 5 years ago. So I should say Hanan Porat, Zichron Livracha. Very interesting guy. We were at 2 points on the scale, but absolutely one end of the scale. Yet we could talk and discuss and debate, but that was a long time ago. So that's when the party was set up. They then formed what's known as the national movement, with Moledet was a party, Cherut was a party, as you remember, and together they formed this movement, and they won 4 seats in 1999. So you can see where the country had been going, the way we've been going through it. From the first election victory in 1977, Menachem Begin and the Likud party, to going right the way through to 1999, which is only 22 years later, by the way, not ever a long time, to the extreme right wing getting 4 seats. Now, after that, they were always involved in making coalitions and in ensuring that they were in power in some shape or form. Now we go back to Bezalel Smotrich, because this is what he said 2 days ago from the rostrum of the Knesset, pointing to the Arab members of the Knesset, of which there are 14 more in all, saying to them, you are here by mistake because Ben-Gurion didn't finish the job. Now, that, and David might disagree with me, we can have that debate when we come to opening up. That is fascism and racism in no uncertain terms. And I'm happy to stand and be quoted on that statement. Arabs are here by mistake because Ben-Gurion didn't finish the job. So who's this guy? Now, why is he such an important figure in this whole makeup? If Netanyahu had managed to form a government, Bezalel Smotrich would be the Minister of Education. I'll say that again. Because Netanyahu was trying to form this government with all trickim and shtickim, as they called it, Smotrich demanded and was allocated, if you like, in the pre-election toing and froing, the Ministry of Education. Not only of religious education, this is the Minister of Education for the whole country. He became the party leader in 2019, and he formed this ultra-nationalist party with a coalition with a guy called Itamar Ben-Gvir. Now, you've heard that name before from me. Itamar Ben-Gvir lives in Hebron. He had to take it down when he came member of the Knesset, a huge photograph of Dr. Goldstein, the guy who massacred 32 Arabs in a mosque in Hebron, because Itamar Ben-Gvir is a Kahani, what you call it, come out of Kahani. Someone not muted, or muting you. Itamar Ben-Gvir today, funnily enough, was in a pushing and shoving match with the leader of the Arab Joint List, Odar, in a hospital in Rehovot. Why? Because in the hospital, being treated by Israeli doctors and trying to save his life, is an Arab terrorist who'd been sitting in jail, who went on hunger strike, I think 3 months ago. He's been on hunger strike for a long time. And they're trying to save his life. So the Arab guy, the Arab leader of the Arab Joint List, went to visit him, to sort of support him. Ben-Gvir arrives, and of course, all hell breaks loose. Because the director of the hospital won't let Ben-Gvir in to the guy's ward. And Ben-Gvir says, who the hell are you to stop me going in? I'm a member of the Knesset. And then they start pushing and shoving. They literally start pushing and shoving, and they have to get pulled apart. Members of the Knesset, both of them. Now, They've got 5 seats in the Knesset, and there's never, ever a moment when there isn't chaos, when either Ben-Gvir gets up to speak or Smotrich gets up to speak. Now, this has been brought about by Netanyahu urging them to run. There was a time that they said, right, why don't you join with Yamina? Because that's where they came out of originally. Smotrich was part of Bennett, and now we close the circle of the trouble that Bennett's got, because, not Ben-Gvir, because Smotrich initially was part of the right, of the right, not the extreme right. But Netanyahu wanted to try and form a party. The only way he could get it to his 61 seats was if these guys formed this faction, if you like, for want of a better word, called Religious Zionism, Tzionut Hadatit, and got across the threshold, which they did, just. But the just is enough to give them 5 seats, and that's where they are. So the religious parties make up a very, very important part of the lawmaking process that takes place, and they cannot be negated, because what happens with these parties is what Kanievsky says people will do. I'm obviously simplified, but it's almost as simplistic as that, where the rabbi will say, this is the petek, this is the note that's got a D on it for Degel Torah or UTJ or Tzionut Hadatit, and that's the petek you put in the box. That's the note you put in the box. That's how you vote. The same way as the Minister of Finance has got his Russian base, then he doesn't have to do anything, because all the Russians will vote for Yisrael Beiteinu. Doesn't matter. The same way as the religious community, and this is remember, this is the Haredi community. Although Smotrich wears a kippah shruga and knitted kippah, right? He is a religious Zionist, so he doesn't really fit in. But the other parties are Haredi religious parties. And the rabbis have a huge, huge influence on the way people vote. Okay, so that's how I want to bring. I left 10 minutes. Good timing.